This is a rare look at an assembly line of what some see as America's energy future, the components of nuclear power. Tiny uranium pellets fill 12-foot-long rods. Bundled together, they become assemblies. Inside reactors, the assemblies act as engines, creating nuclear energy for up to 6 years. Once finished, they are highly radioactive waste that could be dangerous for thousands of years. And that's the problem. How do you dispose of nuclear waste?
Actually, how you dispose of that stuff is just one problem with it. There's a whole different problem that is happening right now, but seeing it being built like that is helpful for understanding what we're dealing with. You saw those little pellets of uranium, right? They're somewhere between like Tootsie Roll sized and Cadbury egg sized uranium pellets. Those uranium pellets are stacked inside these thin 12-foot-long tubes. They are metal tubes, basically just filled with pellets of uranium. That's what we call fuel rods. And that's essentially the business end of a nuclear reactor. Big, long fuel rods like that, mounted vertically, are inserted into a steel containment vessel. What's happening inside, when the reactor's going, is a nuclear reaction, nuclear fission, atoms splitting. But instead of creating a nuclear explosion, it is a controlled reaction. Instead of blowing up, the nuclear reaction creates a lot of heat. And the heat is what we are after, because the heat is what these reactors use to make a whole lot of electricity. To make that nuclear reaction that makes that heat, those uranium pellets are the fuel. And just like any fuel, it gets used up eventually. Your 12-foot-long fuel rod full of those uranium pellets, that lasts about 6 years in a reactor. With a reactor, in effect, turned on, the fission process over about 6 years uses that uranium fuel up. It becomes something they call spent fuel. And when they call it spent fuel, what they mean is that it is degraded enough that even though it's still wicked radioactive, it is no longer efficient for doing what nuclear power plants are supposed to do, which is generating lots of heat, boiling a bunch of water, making a bunch of steam that spins a bunch of turbines that make electricity. So here's the problem. After you've gotten your good 6 years out of your uranium pellet-filled fuel rods, what do you do with them? What do you do with your expired fuel? What do you do with that spent fuel rod? Even after it's been taken out of service, it is still incredibly hot. I mean, thermally hot, like touching the stove hot. But it's also very, very radioactive. And what you do with it is you put these really hot, really radioactive fuel rods underwater. You put them in pools that, in the case of these Japanese reactors that we're focusing on, are pools that are about 40 feet by 45 feet. First of all, the water just physically cools down the fuel rods. But the water also provides some shielding for their radioactivity. Just like with an active reactor that has to get shut down for some reason, these spent fuel rods essentially need to be treated the same way. They're so hot that they need to be kept underwater. And the water can't just sit there either. It needs to be circulating. So it is cooling these rods off. If the cooling system stops and the rods are hot enough, if that water stops circulating, the fuel rods are so hot they will boil off the still water that is covering them. And if the rods boil off the water that is covering them, so the water level drops and the fuel rods get exposed to the air, what happens? Same thing as in an active reactor that's been shut down. It's not good. The uranium, remember, is little pellets. They're inside these long metal tubes. If those tubes are exposed to the air, the metal oxidizes and starts to break down. These pipes are not zirconium, but it's sort of like the same idea of rusting, right? It's not rusting, it's oxidization. But you can understand it because we're all familiar with what happens when something gets rusty, right? The metal breaks down, it starts to degrade. If the bottom of your car looks like this, like mine does right now, you start to worry about whether or not you're going to need to replace the whole things, whether you're going to need some framework done, or whether you just need a new car. Rust. Zirconium doesn't rust, but it does oxidize when it is exposed to air. So the combination of the heat and the oxidization, it's sort of like super fast rusting. Exposing those hot zirconium fuel rods to the air causes oxidization of the metal holding in the uranium. It's like super fast rusting on steroids, and that's trouble. Between that oxidization and the heat, the metal starts to break down. That allows the uranium to get exposed, and the uranium is so hot that it too begins to melt. It's the same thing that's true for fuel rods in active reactors that have to get shut down. It's also true for spent fuel rods sitting in a pool. They're all hot and radioactive, right? These fuel rods have to be cooled for anywhere between 5 to 10 years before they're safe enough to be taken out of these pools and put into dry cask storage. Until they are safe enough for that, they need constant attention. They need a constantly operating cooling system to keep them covered up with that water. Or we are talking about the same kind of meltdown that you see in an active reactor that has been shut down for some reason. The difference is that with the spent fuel rods, it's probably worse. I realize this is a tough time to say worse. I'm not saying it to be upsetting. I'm saying it because I think it is frankly less upsetting to actually understand what's going on than it is to not understand. And this is understandable. The reason spent fuel rods can be even more dangerous than a shut down active nuclear reactor is because of two things. First, a spent fuel pool that loses its cooling system and has all of its water evaporate, it's a potentially greater source of a radiation leak than a reactor is, simply because there are often more fuel rods in a spent fuel pool than there are in an active reactor. The stuff just has to sit there for 8 or 10 years, right? So sometimes they make it a lot of stuff just sitting there in the same pool, which means if there is a loss of cooling system to that pool, if there is a meltdown, there is more uranium to form a bigger radioactive mass that everybody is hoping we never have to contemplate. The other reason, though, that spent fuel rods are potentially more dangerous even than a shut down regular reactor is because of where these pools are. When a reactor shuts down, you have to worry about the cooling system over the fuel rods there. That's taking place inside an incredibly strong internal containment vessel. And that incredibly strong internal containment vessel, that's housed inside an incredibly strong external containment vessel. One of our guests the other night described this as sort of a Russian doll type system, right? It's a containment vessel inside a containment vessel. The spent fuel pools that we've been talking about can be just as radioactive, can often have more fuel rods in them, but they're not necessarily kept in that Russian doll style multiple containment system. They don't want to move these fuel rods far from the reactors that they come out of. They are, of course, super hot and super radioactive. You don't really want to be trucking them across the country. But in these reactors that are in trouble in Japan, where do they move those fuel rods to? They just move them to here. They're just up top. They're essentially just protected by the one external containment wall. And that external containment wall is something that we're all very familiar with looking at pictures of right now. External containment walls that have been blown off from very explosions over the past few days. This is the Daiichi nuclear plant in Fukushima we have been talking about. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 were working when the earthquake hit on Friday. Because of the quake, they shut down. The difficulty in keeping cool those shut down but still very hot reactors is what we have been focusing on for the past few days. But there are 3 other reactors at Daiichi. We have not been talking about them as much because when the quake hit, they were not producing power. They were turned off already for maintenance. What those 3 reactors have, the reason that we are talking about them now, is because they have spent fuel pools. They have spent fuel pools inside them. And as far as we can tell, those spent fuel pools are just protected by those outer containment walls. We've had 2 fires and an explosion at one of these reactors with spent fuel pools in it, with a spent fuel pool in it. We've had reports of the water level dropping at 2 other spent fuel pools. These are the spent fuel pools at Fukushima. There is trouble there keeping them cool, and there is danger because of it. At reactor 4, there has been an explosion, and there have now been 2 fires. We know that an explosion there cracked the roof. It appears that damage to the spent fuel rods is what is allowing for a release of radioactivity there. Japanese authorities did report a large spike in radioactivity after the fire at number 4. What that means is that either the force of that explosion or the smoke from that fire or both carried aloft the radioactive particles being released by those damaged spent fuel rods, by those uranium pellets inside those big, now probably damaged metal tubes. This is not a nuclear explosion. There are not nuclear chain reactions going on here. But this is a means by which radioactivity is being released into the atmosphere. And the question is whether or not those fuel rods, even if they're already damaged, whether they can be resubmerged. Japanese officials today floated the idea of helicopters dropping water on them today. They raised the idea of fire trucks or fire hoses being used to get water on them today. We're now going to turn to some expert help in trying to understand what the best hopes are for getting this situation under control.